History of Social Work in Canada project. And today I'm interviewing Mr. George Cove, who's had long experience in social work in Newfoundland. Mr. Cove, in order to begin, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your early life.
Thank you. I was born in Stones Cove, Fortune Bay, Newfoundland, on October the 13th, 1923. I went to school there, completed a high school there, and then began a teaching career. I taught in half a dozen places in Fortune Bay until 1950, when I left the university and came to work with the newly established Department of Public Welfare.
Were you at Fortune Bay during the Depression, Mr. Cove?
Yes, and these were very rough times. It so happened in the community where I was born and grew up, times were not that rough because it was a prosperous fishing community. It was located on right close to the fishing grounds, and it was fairly easy to catch fish there, but it wasn't as easy to sell it all the time. That was the only problem. Those of us who lived in Stones Cove really don't know very much about the kind of poverty that was experienced in many other parts of Newfoundland, even in other places in Fortune Bay. In Fortune Bay, it's some of the worst places and some of the best places in terms of being able to earn a living.
Fortune Bay is somewhere obviously on the coast, since it was a fishing village.
That's right.
It is a fishing place. What kind of communication and transportation did you have to some of the more urban places in Newfoundland?
Well, all transportation was by boat. There were no roads anywhere. There were no telephones anywhere. And there were telegraph systems. Most of these places have relocated since. The place, Stones Cove, where I was born, was deserted back in the early 60s. And most of the 35 communities that I had in my district when I went there as a welfare officer, and I'll get to that later, have now been abandoned.
With that kind of remoteness and difficulty in getting to places with more population, what did people do for medical care, or what we now call, well, what was it called, relief, I guess?
Yes. Well, medical care. There was a medical doctor in Fortune Bay for as long as I can remember, and even I guess as long as my parents would be able to remember. It was located in different places at different times. It was never located in Stones Cove, by the way. Located in places 10 miles away, 15 miles, you know. And each of them had his own boat, which he used to visit regularly, and also in times of emergency, when you would send a telegram to ask him to come. And the general medical services were more or less satisfactory to the people at that time, unless there was some epidemic. Like I remember one time there was an epidemic of diphtheria, and in a couple of communities over half the people died. But apart from a serious emergency, people seemed to be satisfied with the services. The doctor was usually available. That's one of the problems with the diphtheria epidemic. There was no doctor available during the summer, which aggravated the situation. When he came in September, he had a big problem with Cove, and a lot of people died in the meantime.
Where had you been in the summer?
I'm not sure, away for some reason, you know, not sure of that.
But was that a regular thing, that you'd have no doctor in the summer?
No,
Oh, it was
no, just one of these things. Changeover or something, I don't know the details of that,
Yeah.
but I remember the incident quite vividly.
Yeah. What about relief? Was there such a thing in Fortune Bay at that time?
Oh, yes, there's been relief to the poor in Newfoundland since, you know, the past 200 years, you know, since we had any kind of elected kind of government. And it was delivered in those days by a team of people called relieving officers. And there was one of those on the south coast, one for the whole south coast, by the way, to start with. But they grew rather fast, and by the time I began working there as a welfare officer, there were half a dozen of them, and I replaced 3 of them in my district. But the relief program was kind of scanty. It was the infamous 6 cents a day we talked about in Newfoundland, you know, $1.80 a month per person. And that went on right up until 1946, by the way, when it was changed to $5 a month per person.
You mentioned that you were teaching until about 1950. Were you teaching during the war?
Yes. Yeah, I started in 41.
How did the war affect you and what you were doing at the time?
It didn't very much. It was something we would read about in the post office. Daily accounts would come through the telegraph system, you know, and would be written up in a book on a daily basis. And those of us who had radios, not very many, would hear about it. But in terms of its direct effect on the way of life, it didn't have very much. Except of course, there were quite a few people who did volunteer for service, and of course that brought all these families into the reality of it all.
Did you go to university to get your BA at some time?
Yes, well,
Before, or when was that?
as a teacher, you know, now in those days, the university, the Memorial College was not a university, it wasn't granting degrees. That didn't happen until after Confederation. It offered a 3-year program for teachers. First year teacher training, it's called, and then 2 other years for 2 other teaching grades. And before that, there were a couple of 6-week summer courses for teachers, which would give them a certificate each year. I did these 2 summers and 2 of the 3 university years. And I was in the second year when I decided to come to work with the Department of Public Welfare. I subsequently, after coming to work with the department, attended the Maritime School in Halifax and finished up at Memorial with a Bachelor of Arts in Social Welfare.
You decided to come to work for the department in 1950. What encouraged you to come to work for the Department of Public Welfare?
Well, the department had just been started following Confederation, and they were trying to set up a delivery system around the province with people who had a level of education a little more than these relieving officers who'd been out there for a long, long time. They advertised for people with 2 years, at least 2 years university. And that just suited me. I was in my 2nd year, you know. And the pay was about double that of a teacher. And I guess that's the reason why I came to work with the department. I might have even had in mind just coming here for the summer, you know. That has been a long summer.
That's 34 years
Right.
worth of summertime there. What was your job, your first job?
Well, As I said, the department had just established a delivery system, and they were looking for 25 welfare officers with at least 2 years university to go out around the province and deliver all of these newfound programs that had come with Confederation. And so I was sent up to Fortune Bay, where I travel around in Cove, where I come from, and where I taught school, and where I knew all the people up there anyway, to travel around to 35 communities to deliver the programs of the department. Now, the programs of the department that the people in Fortune Bay and in most of rural Newfoundland knew about and required were financial assistance programs, income maintenance programs. While certain programs in the child welfare field and in the care of the elderly had been put into place by the government before we became a part of Canada, they were really used by the urban people, by St. John's and Corner Brook, places like that. Very rarely in Fortune Bay did I find some old person who wanted to get into the home for aged and infirm in St. John's, or some child who had to be placed in an orphanage in St. John's, or somebody who wanted to adopt a child. That was rare. 98% of my work, so maybe 99, was in the delivery of financial assistance programs. Now, that was a tremendous change. That was the Confederation of Canada brought a tremendous change in the financial benefits that were available to our people. That's by far the biggest event in the history of public welfare in Newfoundland. There are some other highlights, but that one is by far the biggest. Put it in perspective now. Old age pensions, for instance. Back as far as 1911, Newfoundland had an old age pension program of $50 a year to people who were 75. Now that was improved over the years, but at the time we became a part of Canada, in March 1949, the old age pension program was provided for $10 a month. $10 a month to a married pensioner, and $6 a month to single pensioners who were 75 years of age. All of a sudden, in April 1949, these same people, and people who were 70 now, received $30 a month, which means a man and a wife received $60 a month, as compared with the $10 the month before. And even make it even more interesting, in July that summer, July 49, it went to $40. So here you would have an elderly couple getting $80 a month in July, who up till March 49 had been getting only $10. Tremendous impact. You can imagine the impact. They had money enough, they didn't know what to do with, you know. Family allowances, of course, were non-existent before Confederation. And then in April 49, Newfoundlanders started to get $6 and $8 per month per child. And Newfoundlanders at that time had big families, most of them. The assistance to widows and sick people and so on, up until March 49, was about $10 a quarter money, referred to as the widow's mite.
Widow's what?
Mite, biblical term. Anyway, the government right after Confederation brought in a mother's allowance program of $25 a month, plus an extra amount for each child, and a dependence allowance program of $25 a month, and for disabled individuals. And then the old age pension I mentioned also covered blind people. It was old age and blind, so they were receiving $40 a month too. And then by 1952, the old age assistance program came in of $30 a month for people who were 65. And all in all, it was a great financial bonanza for our people. The able-bodied, interestingly enough, the able-bodied didn't fare very well at all this. As I said earlier, they'd been getting $1.80 a month up until 46, and then $5 a month up to Confederation. Well, Confederation wasn't a bonanza for them, people who were able-bodied. The government, I suppose, thought we shouldn't have this kind of a thing, you know, this new Canada's newest province. There shouldn't be no need for people to be on the dole, you know, as it was called. So they instituted relief works programs, and where people were paid wages and drew unemployment insurance benefits. A special unemployment insurance benefit was created to accommodate Newfoundlanders, because in those days you had to have a history of employment over the preceding 2 years, you know. And the Newfoundlanders obviously didn't have that, so some special scheme. A scheme, by the way, not unlike the present UIB scheme, you know, interestingly enough. So in addition to that, the next couple of years, the government required people to work for relief, you know. And one way or another, the government tried to get rid of able-bodied relief. And we weren't having a lot of success with it, so on June the 15th, 1952, they just cut it out, abolished assistance to the unemployed. And that lasted all that summer and fall, and in January '53, the government was compelled to bring it back. You know.
What happened
and
to
it was recognized, and it had a rough time for the next 3 or 4 years, but in 1956, it was recognized as an ongoing necessity and was integrated into the regular social assistance scheme of things. And we've had no troubles with that going with it ever since.
What was it that happened to compel the government to reinstate the program?
Well, there's a lot of people couldn't manage without it, you know. And even though it had been cut out, you know, a lot of people just had to be assisted, because there was assistance available to people who were sick and widowed and whatever, you know. So a lot of the funds for that program had to be used to keep people from starving.
Mr. Pope, and thinking back to what you had mentioned about Fortune Bay and during the Depression, where there wasn't, the Depression wasn't suffered to such a large extent as it was in other parts of Newfoundland. As you describe your work as a welfare officer dispensing various benefits that came through the province from Confederation, what kinds of needs were you seeing at this time in 1950? Was there extensive poverty then?
In certain places, there was. In some of the places in my district, I hadn't known much about them until I began teaching, going around to these places. You know, the first place that I taught school in was one of the most poverty-stricken areas. Now, I have a sort of a theory about this, you know. Looking at the communities that were poverty-stricken and those that were relatively well off. See, I said earlier that the community of Stones Cove was right near the fishing grounds. You could go out and catch a fish and be back in 15 minutes. You know? And the people traditionally could sell their fish. Newfoundland had a fishing economy, and it's still a pretty big part of our economy. You know? It was all of it at that time, practically all of it, especially on the south coast. Other areas there was some mining and forestry and whatever going on, but on the south coast it was practically all fishing. In my district, the area where I grew up for sure, people could catch fish and could sell fish. Now, I guess that's why the people settled there in the first place. You know, some couple hundred years ago now, nearly, because they saw they could earn a living. Now, there were some other parts of Newfoundland, and there were some communities on the south coast like that, where people came and settled close to the country. They settled in the bottoms of bays, at the mouth of a river, or you know, and tried to eke out a living from the land. And that's very difficult to do in Newfoundland. In most parts of Newfoundland, it's very difficult to make a living off the land. There are some areas on the west coast where it can be done. But on the south coast, it's a rocky, barren place, and it's difficult to make a living out of it. And not only that, if you could grow some vegetables or something, there's nobody coming around to purchase it from you. Whereas if you caught fish, collecting boats would come around and purchase it, you know. But not so with anything you produced from the land. So these people had an impossible situation to start with, and it never got any better. The only hope for them was to go away and earn their living somewhere else, you know. And the people who wanted to live off the land were not inclined to go away to some other part of the province and work on fishing boats or whatever. Whereas the people who earned a living from the fishery, like in Stones Cove, were inclined to go away. And a lot of them did, you know. There was never room enough around the coastline for all the people who lived there to earn a living. So some of them every year went away, you know, to some other parts of Newfoundland, even Nova Scotia. A lot of South Coast people went to Nova Scotia to fish. Now, the poverty in these places, the community where I first taught school, and I went there when I was 17, was a poverty-stricken community. You can never imagine. There hadn't been a teacher there for a full year before that time. I was the first to spend the full school year. They would have a teacher for 5 months, and then he or she would go somewhere else for 5 months. And by the way, I was the 6th or 7th pope to go to that place from Stones Cove to teach.
Oh, carrying on family tradition.
Yes. They were practically all illiterate people. All the adults were, and the children were, you know, hadn't had much opportunity. They didn't fish. As I said, they tried to earn a living from the land, and they would they would go in the country and get rabbits and moose, and that was their diet, wild meat every day of the year, you know. Seasons, open season, but nothing to them, you know. It was, and their houses were in awful shape, you know. Little furniture, you know. I think the only place with any paint on it was the place where I stayed. You know.
Did you board with someone?
Yes, with an old lady who died not long ago. She lived to be about 100. You know. That was the only place that had any paint, as I say, and any semblance of furniture in it at all, you know. She was the lady who always boarded the teacher, you know, the 6 or 7 who'd been there before.
What kinds of social services existed in those communities in 1950?
The income maintenance programs that I mentioned, they were available, of course, to everybody. That's about all. These people, I'm not aware, but as I said earlier, there were a few cases of children who had been placed in orphanages or old lady to be placed in the home in St. John's. But there were no social services as we know them today.
What happened to people who needed help then? A child whose family died, or the old lady whose family had abandoned her, or
relatives cared for them.
Were the churches taking a role in that kind of thing at the time?
Not really. The church's role was in the field of education, in religion, of course, and they were very active in education. We have a denominational education system in Newfoundland. That's one of the reasons for it. The church leaders were about the only people in a lot of rural areas who could give direction to the education program in these areas. But they weren't in the social services feel in these rural areas very much. They were in the urban areas. That's a whole story in itself. The church's involvement in St. John's, say, Cornerville, and not the rural areas. There were some fraternal organizations on the go. The Orange Association was fairly active on the South Coast, and that helped out a lot of people.
What kind of people did you?
Well, again, financial assistance. This really goes back to the time before Confederation, really, when these meager financial benefits were available. Somebody had to help out then, sort of, and the Orange Associations on the South Coast and other fraternal organizations, other parts of the province, helped out. But once all these financial benefits came after Confederation, that sort of involvement on the part of fraternal organizations fizzled out, even in the urban areas.
You stayed as a welfare officer in Fortune Bay for
3 years.
Now, what did
3
you do
years.
there?
Well, my career in the department, as I said earlier, spans 34 years, and it has 4 distinct phases to it. And that's the first phase, my stint in Fortune Bay as a rural welfare officer, traveling around in a boat, in the winter time, away from Stones Cove. I had my office in Stones Cove. I had no cases there, idly, but that's where my office was. Traveling around in the winter time on the sea all months. In the summertime, having a holiday because it's good weather and long days and no work. But in the winter time, completely opposite. After 3 years of that, I moved into the St. John's district welfare office setup. And that's where I spent the next 10 years. I started out as a welfare officer, and then we established a creature called intake officer, and I worked at that for a while. And then I became supervisor, assistant superintendent, actually supervisor of the unit. And then for the last 3 years, I was superintendent of that particular office. For the next 10 years, from 63 to 73, I worked here in the Confederation building, in the main office, as a director of 5 or 6 different divisions at one time or another. And then in 73, from 73 until now, I have been one of the assistant deputy ministers here. And interestingly enough, I have the responsibility for the same programs that I had served as director of during the preceding 10 years.
Nice continuity there.
Yes. It's good shape to be in, to become assistant deputy minister. It's a good experience to have had.
Yeah.
I came to St. John's in 1953. As I say, I worked started out as a welfare officer. That was a newly established office. They continued the old scheme of things in St. John's up until that time.
How were things different? You were doing essentially the same job, I guess, that you've been doing at Fortune Bay. How was it different here in St. John's?
Well, it was quite different. Quite different. These programs that I mentioned earlier that were around before Confederation and that were continued after Confederation were, of course, in full bloom in St. John's. So there was lots of child neglect and juvenile delinquents and family difficulties and old people and disabled people who needed care. And there are all kinds of needs for social service here in St. John's. Partly, I suppose, because they've been around there for some time anyway, And how far back nobody really knows, This is an interesting thing to get into. And partly because, I suppose, the extended family wasn't as strong here as it was in the outports. It was a different kind of caseload, so to speak, altogether here.
You wouldn't have spent nearly so much time traveling, I suppose.
Oh no travel really. Yeah. No travel. All the thing we had a welfare officer had a geographical district in the city. You just travel around it in 15 minutes. So, whereas in Parson Bay that took up a lot of the time. However, a lot of the travel up there was down in the nights, and weekends. It was it was a 7-day-a-week job up there. Sometimes it was 16 or 18 hours a day. Far cry. And here it was from 9 to 5.
Yes. Yeah.
No travel.
When you first came to St. John's, what other social agencies existed at that time?
Well, in St. John's at that time, in the financial assistance field, from government point of view, there was only the department. Now, only our department. This is an interesting note about the history of all this in Newfoundland. There's never been any government involvement apart from the provincial government department. There's never been any municipal government involvement. As a matter of fact, municipal government is new itself in Newfoundland, and it never did broaden out into the welfare field. Now there were some private agencies in the financial assistance field. The St. Vincent de Paul Society was a going concern here. It may even still be on the go, but when I worked in the St. John's office, it gave a lot of help to a lot of people. The Dorcas Society was a similar society doing similar kinds of work. I think that has disappeared. All the churches, particularly the Salvation Army, were heavily involved in helping the poor. So there was a fair amount of involvement in terms of financial assistance. But in terms of other services, there was very little involvement in the private sector. The Welfare of Children Act, which was passed in Newfoundland in '44, had a chapter in it dealing with children's aid societies, but it was never implemented.
You've never had them?
Never had them, no. And in 1964 it was taken out of the Act. Never had.
Who ran the Home for the Aged and Infirm that was in St. John's at the time?
Yes, well, that goes back to the 1860s, That place was around for over 100 years. And the Department of Public Welfare ran it after Confederation. And before that, from 31 to 49, there was a Department of Health and Public Welfare, in which there was a division of public welfare, and that division ran the home. Before that, from the time it started in the 1860s up to 31, it was run by what was known as the Bureau of Public Charities, that ran the financial assistance programs and whatever programs that were available for children and so on. As I said earlier, nobody knows very much about what happened in those days, but I'm convinced that from about 1870 on, there were welfare programs around, but nobody's ever been able to research it and document it. I don't think that we're clear about what happened since 1931, but there were a lot of things in place before 31. I'm convinced of that, and we know about some of them, like the home for aged and infirm. Now, the churches were also involved in another area, in the care of children in orphanages. And that goes back a long ways. There are orphanages around there for more than 100 years. You know? It's all disappeared now, of course.
Did you have anything to do with either the poorhouse, as it was called, or the orphanages in those early years in St. John?
Yes, well, the poorhouse, as it was called, I didn't know. I remember visiting the place, and that closed up in about 65, and the new one over here on where the Cove Road was opened. I visited, but that's not, and I might have had something to do with making an application for somebody to get in there. I don't remember for sure. But that's a program division that I never worked in. I said earlier I was director of different programs. That's one I missed, the only one I missed, by the way. So I never had any direct involvement with services to the elderly, you know, in my career. And but now the orphanage is a different story. Yeah, I had lots of involvement with them. They were all here when I became director of child welfare in 1963. And during my term, they disappeared. We started to expand our foster home program, different kinds of foster homes, and we opened an institution for mentally retarded children, which, by the way, closed in June '83. And we accelerated our adoption program, and we changed the course somewhat in our social assistance program for unmarried mothers. And for all these reasons, the need for orphanages disappeared. And not only that, the number of orphans disappeared. The kind of children we began to get were not children who didn't have any parents, whose parents were in the cemetery. They were children who had parents who were out around, you know, having a good time, not accepting the responsibilities for their youngsters, you know. And these were not the kind of children who fitted into orphanages, you know. We found that they fitted into a family type situation, a foster home, you know, more than an orphanage, you know. And also we managed to get a lot of them back with their parents, you know, and with relatives especially. So for a whole variety of reasons, our child care program was changed and improved and expanded so that the need for orphanages disappeared.
Mr. Cove, I've sometimes observed that getting a place with bricks and mortar closed is one of the more difficult things that a social welfare officer can do. What was it like trying to phase out those institutions?
No problem. We've discovered, and we closed out a lot of institutions, 3 in the past year. We've discovered that the easy way to close out institutions is to render them unnecessary. And that's what we did here. And that's what we did with the home for unmarried parents, you know, established in Army Rand. That's what we did with the training school for delinquents, and with the home for mentally retarded people. By finding other ways in the community, to render these places unnecessary. And once it becomes empty, you know, there's no problem to close it out.
How do boards of directors of independent agencies?
Well, some of the places we closed out have been owned by the government anyway, so the board is not a problem. But even where there are boards, there's been no problem, no. No, they have been prepared to go on to do different things. Now I should say there's one institution that used to be called an orphanage, Mount Cashel Orphanage, that is still in existence, but it's dropped the term orphanage, and it's cut down its population from about 200 to about maybe 60, and it has 4 distinct units to it. 4 distinct independent units. So it's just it's 4, you know, large-sized group homes really. We've gone into the group home system in a big way in the province, you know. That one is still necessary, but I thought of it when you raised the question of the boards, you know, their reaction to this. We had a discussion a few years ago with the people who run with the Christian brothers who run Mount Castle. Now they were quite prepared to close it down or to change its focus, you know. They were quite prepared to do what was needed in the field of child care as we saw it. And we decided to continue it on a vastly modified scale. You know.
So, the government working together with the private sector, the institution was able to adjust.
That's right. That's right. Yes, that's right. No problems at all with that.
I wonder if that might be a place to take a break. This is
During the 10 years when I.
What, 63 to 73?
Yeah, during the 10 years that I served as director of divisions there, 2 significant developments.
Yeah.
One was the Canada Assistance Plan. That had a tremendous impact. That was the event next to Confederation in terms of its impact on the Department of Public Welfare. In the first place, it provided 50% cost sharing by the federal government for most of the things that we were doing, practically all of them, in fact. And the second place, it set certain standards that we were required to follow. And it introduced the needs test concept, which certainly turned out to be beneficial to social assistance recipients.
How was it beneficial?
Well, in that we were required to consider items of basic assistance in determining the needs test, whereas before that time we had rates of assistance for different items. And only one was routinely considered, the rate for food. The other items, shelter, clothing, personal care, household maintenance, and utilities, these things were not routinely considered. And in fact, in rural areas, they weren't considered at all. And when coming to the Canada Assistance Plan, they were routinely, automatically, it was a part of the agreement that these things would be taken into account right up front. And that meant a tremendous financial benefit to our people. And at the same time, it was all practically all cost shared. So the net cost to the province didn't grow at that particular time because of the CAP reduction.
Mr. Pope, there's sometimes a resentment, currently, today, resentment about the federal government imposing restrictions on how provinces use money that comes from the federal tax coffers. In 66 and 67, when the Canada Assistance Plan and the ERDP Act came into place, how did people in your province feel about additional federal involvement in social services?
Well, I guess we were so glad to get the money, get the cost sharing feature, that we weren't concerned about that kind of thing. In fact, as I said earlier, we were required under these schemes to do more than we had been doing anyway. So it meant no limitation to us. As a matter of fact, the Canada Assistance Plan is still not limiting us. There's more that, with 1 or 2 exceptions, there's more that can be done within the Canada Assistance Plan than we are actually doing. There are 1 or 2 exceptions, such as construction of houses and things like that. But by and large, we're not limited by the Canada Assistance Plan at all.
I feel moved to ask you a specific question about that because of my own background in social planning. Is your province able to use the Canada Assistance Plan for advocacy, social planning kinds of activities?
Well, we are using it for the social planning in helping the social planning council here.
Mm-hmm.
We are giving them a grant, and that's being cost shared by the federal government.
Mm-hmm. So it is possible in some aspects of the system?
Yes, under the research component of welfare services, the kind of system plan.
You mentioned that during that 10-year period there were two significant developments. One was the cannabis.
Yes,
plan.
yes. The other one was the process of decentralization that began during that period.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I was fresh out of the field, so to speak, for some 13 years, and have been administrator of the largest, by far, district office in the province here in St. John's, and had experienced some frustration with these having to have a lot of decisions made about cases made in main office, you know. So when I reached main office, decided to try and do something about it, you know. And in child welfare, my first job here, director of child welfare, didn't do very much along that line. We did a lot of other things that we've heard alluded to earlier, you know, in rendering the orphanages unnecessary. But when I moved into social assistance, I moved into it when the Canada Assistance Plan came in '66 to implement the impact of this. The social assistance program was run then by a board of people here at main office who decided about cases, eligibility, and whatever, whether they were deserving or not, you know.
On a case-by-case basis?
A case-by-case basis, yes, yes. That's for most of the cases, the cases that were paid from in here. There was always the capability out in the field to issue assistance on the spot, you know. But most of the cases were assisted from here, checks sent out, and that's still going on. Checks sent out from the main office, you know. So I soon realized that this was, not a good system. Not a good system in terms of the ability of the board to make good decisions, a purely mathematical decision, you know. And it was not a good system in terms of how the people in the field felt about it, you know. They knew the decisions being made in there weren't the best that could be made. So, you see, I just come from it, you know. So we set about changing that, and we began to decentralize the social assistance program to the point now where it's 100% decentralized.
As far as the decision?
99.9, so far as the decision-making authority with respect to cases. And it's not only decentralized now to the regional people, but it's to the district people and to the social worker. A lot of it now is right at the grassroots. The people who know most about the circumstances of any given case are the people now who decide, you know, determine what's going to be done.
Mm-hmm.
You know. That was started during that period, and it's complete now in the field of social assistance, but it's not yet complete in the other programs. We just last week took a major step in decentralization of the child welfare program, and VRDP has been decentralized pretty much now. But we're on the way to decentralizing it all, because we believe that that's the way to go in terms of providing the best services to our people out there.
During that 10-year period, I wonder about a couple of other events that may or may not have been occurring here in Newfoundland. Is the staff of the Department of Social Services unionized?
Oh yes, yes. The social worker staff and all the clerical staff are members of the Newfoundland Association of Public Employees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And was that a difficult process, the unionization process?
Oh no. About 10 or 12 years ago, the Public Service Collective Bargaining Act was passed, giving the staff the right to organise and apply for the status of bargaining units, you know. And that's all fallen into place fairly smoothly. There have been the odd disagreements and what have you on the daily, you know, on an ongoing basis. There's the odd grievance and it goes to arbitration even, you know. But all in all, it's worked quite well, I think.
And you had public service strikes that social workers here were involved in?
We had one short strike a few years ago. Strike that lasted a few days. Now, our social workers are in what is known as the General Services Bargaining Unit, you know, and there's some 3,000 or more people into that, you know, which ours they had small numbers, you know. So it was a whole unit that went on strike, and of course our people being part of it, you know, obviously went on strike too.
Mm-hmm.
Whether our staff alone would have gone on strike, we don't know, of course.
It's an interesting question, I think, with the social work principles and ethics.
Yes, yes.
As counterposed with
Yes.
union interests.
Yes, I would like to think that they wouldn't have gone on strike, you know, but I don't know. I don't know.
Another thing that may have happened during that, approximately that same period of time, or perhaps even beginning in 1950, was perhaps a burgeoning of the number of employees doing social work in Newfoundland. Did you see a growth in your colleagues who were doing the same kind of thing that you were?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, as I said, and when we became a part of Canada, we had these relieving officers out around there who were generally not in tune with this kind of work at all, you know. Some of them were small-time businessmen. One of the people I replaced was a sail maker, for instance. And the ranger force, the police force we had at that time, that was modeled from the RCMP. They were involved in it, but there were no people with any social work, education, or background, or whatever in those days. So an attempt was made in 1950 to try and find people who had at least 2 years university education, you know. And these came from the ranks of teachers, you know, practically all of them. And then we started a training course, in-service training course. And in 1952, all of the welfare officers who were around at that time went to Toronto, to the School of Social Work in Toronto for a 6 weeks course. And then the next summer, a couple of professors from the school, Professor John Morgan, Professor Ray Godfrey, came here to St. John's and did part 2 of the course. And then it went from there. Every year we had training courses of that kind.
Mm-hmm.
Then, now in the meantime, our staff the number grew. The staff every year, there were a few added, you know. Then we started getting into supervision. You see, when I was a welfare officer in Fortune Bay, I had no supervisor responsible for the main office in there, and I never heard from them either, you know. But then we got a little more sophisticated, you know, more staff out there. We started thinking in terms of supervision. And the department decided that, well, to be a supervisor, you have to have some education, social work anyway. So we worked a deal with the University of Toronto School of Social Work where we would send two people a year as special students. Now, there was the odd one around that added to the undergraduate degree anyway, so, you know, they could go as a regular student. But by and large, we went as special students. So for about 5 years, two people went to Toronto. And then for the next 5 years, we worked the same deal with the Maritime School in Halifax. And 2 people went, you know. And then the department decided, well, we have to start growing our own here now, you know. So Memorial University started a diploma course. We had talked about starting a community college course, like it's popular around the mainland, as you know. We talked about starting that in the trades college here, you know. But we decided to do it through the university and to make it a 2-year diploma course, something like a community college course. You know. But nobody ever graduated with a diploma. Before the 2 years were up, it was turned into a 4-year degree program. And Bachelor of Arts with a social welfare office, and then subsequently the department was turned into a school of social work, grew into a school of social work, and bachelor's social work degrees were granted, and masters, of course, now. But for a few years now, we have only been accepting people into the department who were graduates, who have a social work degree. And most of them are from Memorial.
Quite a development there.
Oh yes, a tremendous development. I sometimes regret, though, that we didn't transfer the diploma course over to the trades college when we changed it at the university to a degree program, because there is a need for a 2-year course, you know, at the community college level, I think, here. Given the fact that we started a new development there 3 or 4 years ago, we started separating income maintenance from the services, you know, and employed a number of people called social assistance workers, whose job it is to give social assistance, to deliver social assistance only. That's their only job. They're not in the service field at all. And we did that because we were getting a lot of trained social workers now, and we didn't like doing this kind of stuff, you know. And didn't think they were very good at it, and didn't want to be doing it. And a point that I don't fully appreciate, to some degree I do, but not fully. And anyway, that's the way it shaped up. So we established this second stream. Now we don't have any training program for them, you know, and they really need training, as we're finding out. So we have sooner or later, and I would hope it's sooner, we will have to mount some kind of course at the community college level.
Over those years, were you at all involved with the Association of Social Workers here?
Yes, during its struggling years, I was a member. When there were only very few of us, I was a member for a good while, really. But ironically enough, when it started to come into its own and grow, I sort of dropped out of it. Since then, they've made me honorary member of it, you know.
Sorry?
Yeah, honorary member of the,
yes.
Since in the last 3 or 4 years. They made the deputy minister who was here then, who'd had a long experience here too, and me. And I guess I'm not as active in that now as I ought to be.
You moved from the series of directorships to becoming assistant deputy in 1973, was it?
Yes, officially 72 really, but officially 73.
What is your job? What does an assistant deputy do?
Well, my job as assistant deputy minister is twofold really. It's really to assist the deputy in doing his job, in the overall direction of the department, in planning and evaluating what goes on in the department, in his dealings with the government through the minister, and to fill in for him when he's away, such as today, for instance. The other part of the job is to generally oversee a number of programs, and I have 4 programs, 4 program directors reporting to me, and the delivery system. I have social assistance, which is our big money program. It's half our budget. We have a budget of about pushing 200 million now, and social assistance is that. And I have child welfare, and juvenile corrections, and employment opportunities, which I should speak to you about. And it's another event in the 10 years, but it's right on the end of it. And then I have the delivery system, where we have a regional set-up and a district set-up all throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. These are the people who report to me, and these are some of the divisions that I've worked in previously. So I have that. It's part of my responsibility to generally oversee that and be available for consultation with these people, the directors of these programs, and assisting with deputy ministry, bringing our experience with the programs to his attention and to the government's attention for the development of new programs, changes in programs, and what have you. One of the big responsibilities nowadays, in terms of the executive department, is the financial responsibility. Now, this is always, of course, a big responsibility, but it is critical now because of the restraint situation we've been in for so long. We have to be spending a lot of our time now thinking about financial matters, you know. We're in social services, in this department, we're maybe the same in every department, but certainly this one, and more so perhaps. We're in a squeeze. The executive is in a squeeze, you know. There's pressure from coming up about the need for more services, more money. These social assistance rates are not adequate, you know. We need more of this, more group homes, more of this, more something else, you know. And especially with the young offenders that coming on now, that has a big impact for us, you know. More of this, more of that, more money from coming up. And then you have the government up there saying, and the Premier's going to be on tomorrow night, I think, talking about this kind of stuff, you know. Saying, you know, we're in a tight budget, you know, we don't have any money, don't have anything to give you, you know, don't have any money to give you. Try to cut back, try to save. Be very careful about this now, you know. Make sure you don't go over your budget. Go under your budget if you possibly can. Don't go over whatever you do, you know. Stay within it for sure. And, well, at the same time, every piece of paper you get on your desk where everybody who comes to see you is looking for more money. And everybody you meet from Treasury Board or whatever, you know, they're saying, don't spend so much, don't spend as much money.
Put you right in the middle.
Oh, does it ever? Does it ever? And I guess it's the same in every department, but I'd say it's even more so in this one because of the nature of the business we're in, you know, the needs of the people, you know.
During the period of time that you've been assistant deputy, there have been a number of developments in the field of federal-provincial relations about funding of social programs specifically. Have you been at all involved or affected by the developments in relationships with the federal government?
Oh yes, very much so. I was involved with in the first meeting of the development of CAP, for instance, you know, and that has worked well, you know, all through the years. You were saying earlier, but I've been involved quite a bit with other developments. The only real trouble that I'm aware of that we've had is with the Young Offenders Act that's coming in soon. You know, that's trouble to us. That particular one is. I'm not aware of any real difficulties with any of the other talks that we've had.
What difficulties do you anticipate?
Well, there's one major difficulty with it. Newfoundland doesn't have the federal juvenile delinquency act in the area, you know. When we became a part of Canada, we decided to retain our own Welfare Children Act, which had come in 1944, for two reasons mainly. One reason really. because under that act, the courts commit youngsters to the training school directly. And under our act, the most the courts can do is to commit children to the care and custody of the Director of Child Welfare, who may or may not place the child in a training school. Now, to put the thing in perspective, during 1982, the courts committed about 300 children to the care of the Director of Child Welfare. That meant that if they had the power to do so, they would have put them in the training school. There's no doubt about that. But the Director of Child Welfare placed only 80 in the training school. Now you see, when the Young Offenders Act comes on stream, and the courts have the power to do it, they will put them all into training schools. Unless we can build up our community services out there and satisfy the courts that they are effective. Now we're trying to do that, and we're having a lot of success. So I'm hopeful that that this won't turn out to be as bad after all, you know. But if we don't have an alternative that's acceptable to the courts, they will certainly commit the youngsters to training schools, which means we'll have to build more training schools. The other thing that's trouble for us, which was not trouble under the Juvenile Act, is the age limit. Our act goes to age 17, and this one, the new one, will go to age 18.
So that gives you an additional group of people
Yes,
to deal with.
yes. That gives, so that 300 I talked about, like you did before, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's bad news for us, and we've been trying to have Newfoundland excluded from it, you know, without any success.
During the period of time that you've been deputy,
Assistant
deputy, I'm sorry, could you describe what the role has been of the voluntary sector and the private sector in social services, social welfare?
Well, that's a field that really hasn't been checked in Newfoundland, you know. And it goes back to something I said earlier, the fact that we've had no municipal government involvement in the welfare field in this province, which means we've had no local citizen participation in it, which has meant that there has been very little private sector involvement at all. Now, back in the 50s, an attempt was made there to form a social welfare planning council. And it lasted for 2 or 3 years, and the people who were leaders in it moved away, and the thing disappeared. Then in the late 50s, this was in the early 50s, in the late 50s, early 60s, another attempt was started, and I was personally involved in that, and that went on for 4 or 5 years, and disappeared. And there were a number of reasons for that. Then about 5 years ago, I would say, a third attempt was begun, and that's really a going concern. And we're supporting it to some extent financially, directly and indirectly. And the council here is getting some support from other places, getting some project funds and so on. That's really the beginning of the involvement of the private sector in this province. And I see great things in the next 20, 25 years growing out of that attempt. I think that one will last. I think it has a firm foothold, and I think it's done some tremendous things already, no doubt about it. And the Community Services Council was Mrs. Rowe. I don't know if you've met her. Yeah. That has grown, expanded greatly in the past 5 or 6 years, you know, maybe it's a longer than that since it started. And that's spreading out into the community and then involving the community. And I think from that you will see private agencies spring up. Apart from that, the only thing that's on the go here really is church sponsored endeavors. When we started the Grew Home program here a few years ago, we involved the churches in it. Started with the Mennonites, and then the United Church, and they're all in it now. All the religions are in it now, and that's worked well. We have a great partnership going there. The institutions for the elderly, again, got started by the churches. And there's a lot of them around the province now, all sponsored by specific churches or interfaith groups, as they call them, you know. But but apart from church-oriented endeavors, there's not very much on the go here. The closest you can come to it is in some of the health-related agencies, like the Red Cross, and like the CNIB. These have been here for a while, and there is a social service component to it, as you know, but it's primarily health-oriented. In the corrections field, the John Howard Society has made some inroads here. They've done very well. They, by the way, are operating 1 or 2 of our group homes in the province too. Group homes for children. They're primarily involved with adults. They had a rough time getting started, but they're well away here now. But there's a tremendous potential and need in this province for growth and development in the private sector in the social welfare field. And I think it started with the council.
I'm wondering, as we begin to move to a close here, if I can ask you a couple of more general questions. One would be about challenges that you've faced over your years in social work. What were the biggest hurdles that you faced in trying to do what you wanted to?
Now I've never experienced in my whole career any difficulty in trying to do what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do myself. And I think the fact that I've held so many positions in the department indicates that the powers that be, so to speak, were prepared to let me at it, sort of thing, you know, let me try to do something. But now, having the desire to do it, and knowing what you would like to do, and getting it done, you know, are 2 different things. A lot of the things we haven't been able to accomplish, of course, have been because of lack of money. That's been a perennial problem in Newfoundland, you know, and still is, of course. There are all kinds of things that we would like to do. We would like to speed up the process of community-based services, which is a thing we embarked on a few years ago. See, we changed our name from public welfare to social services. And we, from that day, started to develop services in the community. And as I said earlier, we've closed down some institutions, and we're building up our ability out in the province to care for old people and young people, children, with their families. I guess we've adopted a new philosophy. We said that the objective of the department is to maintain and strengthen family life. That might have been always the objective, because when we were in the days when we were giving financial assistance only, that was the objective, of course, you know, because you had to have money to keep a family together anyway. But in terms of services, we said we will try and strengthen and maintain family life. And we will give whatever support in terms of money and in terms of services that we are able to give to enable families who need this kind of help to remain as families. Now, we realize there are some families who are unable and some even unwilling to care for their members. And so, in these cases, when we cannot succeed in supporting them and have to remove them, they have to leave their families, whether it's children or older people or what have you, our next level of, next resource is relatives. We try and get relatives to care for them. And we have financial programs and supportive programs to do that. Only after that fails do we consider removing them from the extended family circle. And then we try then to not remove them from the community circle. We try and keep them in the community. So we're trying to develop services, alternate, substitute, whatever services to care for them in their own communities, or at least not very far away. Now you can't, in Newfoundland, have all the services in all the communities, you know, that's impossible, it's many, but at least not very far away. No longer would we want to place somebody from the West Coast, say, into St. John's, you know, like used to be the situation. Now, what I would like to be able to do is to speed up that process. We've made a fair amount of progress, but I'd like to see that done much faster. And the thing that's slowing it down is the scarcity of money. I think if we had the money, we could get all the resources out that we need, get the staff, which is and most important part of the resource anyway, the properly trained staff to do all these things. Because without that, you know, you can have all the ideas and programs on paper you like. If you haven't got staff to give meaning to them, then, you know, not very much happens.
Right. As well as the challenges, I wanted to ask you about accomplishments of which you were particularly pleased that things have been able to do over the past year.
Oh my, there's a lot of them now. I think one I mentioned earlier that I said I should speak to you about, the division of rehabilitation that we started just before I became assistant deputy minister, and I was appointed director of that program, but I didn't stay there very long. And not only that, that division was renamed shortly after I became assistant deputy minister, renamed the Division of Employment Opportunities. And we had a change of government at that particular time, and the new government set out to remove people from social assistance through training or work experience or what have you. So they gave us 50 new welfare officer positions and appointed me as the director of the program. And we set out trying to, you see, we thought we had a big problem in getting our people to go to work and motivating them to go to work, you know. A lot of us were a bit naive about this. We had the man in the street attitude that all these people on welfare are lazy no-goods, you know. And we thought we were facing a big job to motivate them. So that's what we had these 50 welfare officers for, to motivate the people. That wasn't necessary at all, we found out that all these people wanted, the vast majority of them, was a job. So instead of working on them, we went to work on the employers and Canada Manpower, you know. We bridged the gap to Canada Manpower and managed to get a lot of them into jobs and into training. We found out that by and large, when a man got a job, all these family problems mostly disappeared, you know. Not all of them, of course, not quite simple, but that was a large extent of that. Then we made the most of that for the next couple of years, you know, using the employers and kind of manpower. And then we got the notion that we should start job creation ourselves, you know. So we started in about 75, 76, you know. The government gave us funds for our own projects, you know. And, you know, when we started all this back in 72, we had a social assistance caseload of approximately 30,000 all told. Today, we have about 20,000. And if we hadn't started this program, there's no reason in this world why we wouldn't have 40,000 today. No reason in the world.
So you're seeing tremendous growth.
Oh, tremendous. Now, this year, for instance, now 83, 84, we have a budget of $11 million in this program. And we have removed 4,000 people from the social system caseload this year. Now, it so happens that a large number have come in, you know, because a lot of people are unemployed and leaving UIB benefits, and you know, we're holding our own. I think, unlike any other province in Canada, in fact, I think we're holding our own in the social systems caseload because of this program. Now, if we were in good times and there were not as many new cases coming in, we'd be showing a marked decrease, you know.
Yeah.
So we say we're bailing a lot of water out of the boat, but there's just as much coming in, you know.
Reflection of the times.
Oh yes, sure. Without this program, we would have a very heavy case. So now we had a rough time, and that's one of the reasons why I think I regard it as an accomplishment, you know. We had a difficult time selling this to our staff. They thought that, you know, someone thought, well, all you're doing is putting people over on another kind of welfare or UIB, you know, when we started out looking for jobs in the marketplace, you know, they said, well, you're taking a job away from somebody else and all this sort of thing. But all that's over now, and everybody now thinks it's a good program. And still the fact, though, that a lot of them do go to unemployment insurance benefit. But that's a much better status in Newfoundland than being on the dole, as a lot of them still refer to it, you know. They feel an awful lot better about it, you know. And not only that, a lot of them have disappeared from the social assistance caseload completely, you know. For instance, in May 1972, we did a survey of 6,500 cases who had been employed on projects during the preceding 5 years, from 77 to 82. We found out, we found out that we checked the social system payroll to see how many of these 6,500 were actually getting assistance in May 82. We found out that 77% were not getting assistance. Since that, we tried to follow up these 77% of 4,000 and 4,000 plus, and we followed up not all of them, a good large sample of them, and we found out that about 60% of them still haven't come back with us.
Great.
The large numbers of them are employed, large numbers of them. And it's been an outstanding success. I think it's probably the best thing that ever happened to the department. Apart from the Confederation itself.
Well, I wonder if in closing there's anything that you'd like to add, any little things that we should have talked about and that didn't quite come to the fore.
A lot of things we had talked about, obviously. A lot of things.